answers. But the question really stayed with me. And as I drove home through North Carolina, East Tennessee, back to Nashville, I really, had it on my mind. And it's one thing to think that you're going to write a Southern baking book, but it's a whole nother thing to be able to explain to people who maybe weren't raised on Southern baking what it is and why it's special. And that was the real task at hand. That's
Well,
how it
you
began.
spent 484 pages answering the question. And both Malcolm and I agree that you did a fine job. We can't decide if we were taking a history lesson or taking a series of cooking classes. And luckily,
that's
both.
nice.
Yeah, I mean, you got 200 recipes, but you've got these fantastic historical sketches, stories behind the recipes, which are really, really interesting. And
Thank you.
It's a really beautiful and substantial and good book.
Malcolm, any cookbook that has 50 pages devoted to cornbread.
Now,
is that how many it was? Oh my
You're
goodness.
in.
Yes, it was 53. Actually, 53. To be exact. I kept turning and reading and turning and reading.
Nobody is really given. I just felt like after doing the research and interviewing so many folks, the cornbread really has not gotten the love that it deserves. And I knew that I wanted to begin the book with cornbread because I think a lot of people outside the South don't realize that most of the South has been poor and rural. And had it not been for cornbread to feed people, there would have been no beginning of Southern baking.
Right.
And really, I think what kind of, what we only hear are the sort of the divisiveness or the disagreements about how cornbread should be made. And that's all fun. Believe me, it's fun. And we've all got our stance. But I think what I found is that there's so many ways and so many beautiful ways to make cornbread throughout the South. And yeah, they do differ, but that's what makes it interesting. And I just loved hearing people's stories and diving deep. And I know cornbread is really, a big part of Mississippi as well.
Well, I think you're right that cornbread is something that really hasn't been dealt with in a complete way. And it was a great way to open the book. Something you just said reminded me, when you're talking about the poverty of the South and people not eating, there was a line in a chapter, maybe it was cornbread, that it really made me think. And you were saying that the South, the American South, is about the size of Western Europe. And that really puts in perspective how broad and diverse this region is.
Very much so. I mean, if you consider that I included Maryland, West Virginia, on down through, and included Texas, it is broad and vast. And it's been founded by different peoples, and the agriculture is completely different in those places. The terrain is different, the climate, the weather, the microclimates, all of that is different. And really, those were the two things I found that really affected Southern baking the most, were the people and the land. And they differed. The people and the land differed throughout the South, which is why we've got, so many delightful differences.
Right. Well, the title of the book is Baking in the American South. And I'm just curious, if you would, how do you define the American South? Because you have a little different take on it than maybe some others. You even include D.C. and the White House in here.
Well, those were Southerners who went to D.C., so they happened to be elected president. So that's why I included
those
DC.
People, yeah.
But those people. But if you really, there's a lot of D.C. that considers itself Southern. And, when you head down into Virginia, you are. So I was very broad. I cast a wide net from Maryland all the way down and over to Texas. And I talk about Tulsa, Oklahoma, and with a couple of recipes. And Missouri certainly affected chess pie and a lot of the pie recipes, that probably crept into Arkansas would have come out of the Midwest. Same goes with Kentucky. I mean, Kentucky is Southern in parts, but it's also Midwestern, can be. And I think those border states I found them really interesting. East Texas is much more southern than West Texas. That makes sense. And North Florida is more southern, of course, than the rest of Florida. But I think it's those border states that really made this project interesting, because within them there was southernness. And then, you know, I read Isabella Wilkerson's book. What was the name? I'm sorry. The Warmth of the Other Sun. I'm sorry, blanking on that. Warmth of Another Sun.
Oh, about the diaspora.
About the diaspora and the Great Migration. And, you know, then it really dawned on me too, how many had left the South, how many Blacks left the South during the Great Migration. And, you know, but went to Los Angeles, or they went to Chicago. And that's why these Southern influences on baking still, you know, exist in other parts outside the South. So it was Southern, but it wasn't only deep Southern, as I think that you all in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia know so well. Y'all are the deep South.
And you took special care, it seems to me, to make a place for African American cooks whose recipes historically were eliminated or not included in traditional cookbooks. And you've spent a fair amount of time raising the profile of many of those cooks in your book.
Absolutely. I mean, that was a big part of this too, was to really to lift up and bring to mind people who've never been credited for recipes. And you know, we tend to only think of the Edna Lewis's, who was just phenomenal in her contributions to Southern baking and cooking, because she wrote stories about what it was like to grow up in Freetown, Virginia, in a town that was, you know, was formed by the freed enslaved. And so for her to talk about that was just amazing to me. But I wanted to find other women, and maybe men too. I've got Mr. Charlie's Rolls from West Tennessee, was a school cook in West Tennessee. And then there's Nina Kane from Florence, Alabama, and Maggie Cox from Glendora, Mississippi. You know, these were cooks who worked in other people's homes, but they, you know, and I think that was I really, as much as I grew up loving meringue pies and caramel cake and all these wonderful, wonderful desserts of the South that were labor intensive, I had to realize that there were a lot of women in the South who spent their lives making these desserts, and not out of joy. They were making them for someone else. And then they had to go home to their own kitchen and cook for
And their recipes weren't attributed.
Correct. And they were not given credit. And a lot of those
they appeared in cookbooks, like under the name of Mrs. So-and-so and so-and-so.
Mm-hmm. You are exactly right. And you know, the Buford family from Glendora they're an exception, because they have all of Maggie's recipes in a 3-ring binder and photos of her that still hang on the kitchen wall. And that, you know, that's a part of the South I kind of wanted to open up too. And I think I hope that I did it in a very sensitive way, because as a white woman, I wanted to be careful, but also I wanted to let people know about this. And I want to let people know about them and let their names be known.
Well, and you paid homage to the civil rights movement too, and I enjoyed the story about Zephyr driving from Texas to the White House, the Lyndon Johnson White House. Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. Zephyr Wright was the cook for the Lyndon Johnson family. And when he was in the White House and she needed to get to Washington, D.C. from the ranch in Texas, you know, she could not travel with the first family because of Jim Crow laws. So she had trouble finding a place to stay, finding something to eat, finding rest stops. And she told President Johnson about it. And he would go on to say that it was what she told him affected his signing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
And if I remember correctly, she was standing by his side when he signed it.
And she got the pen that he
Uh-huh.
signed it with. He handed her the pen. Um, I loved her story, and I was so fortunate to make contact with the Presidential Library, Johnson Presidential Library, and they shared those photos that are in the book that were taken in the 1960s, black and white photos of Zephyr Wright in the kitchen with President Johnson. So that was really terrific.
Mm.
And then in your story about Montgomery, Alabama, we were talking about the civil rights movement, and you were saying that pound cakes have built churches, schools, and tell about the Montgomery bus boycott.
Right. Well, that's the Georgia Gilmore pound cake story, and that's a good one. And that is she was told to get off the bus after work and then enter through the back entrance. And as she did that, the bus sped off. And her retaliation, as the only thing she had to do was to be able to fund a boycott. And she did so by baking pound cakes and frying fish. And women baked cakes and sold dinners, and that money was used to help other Blacks have a way to work that did not require riding the bus. And so the bus boycott lasted about over a year. And they called the bakers members of the Club from Nowhere. And I think that's fascinating too, because I think we don't really realize how much baking had long been going on in the black community, and how it was a source of currency and revenue for women to bake cakes and pies and to sell them, whether they sold them at church or sold them at the beauty salon. But baking money, and that was the theme I saw throughout this book, throughout the South, was that how enterprising people could be, Black and white, when hard times set in and you got to make rent. And that's, I'd say, how baking became a currency more valuable than Confederate money, because it outlasted Confederate money, because it was a skill. Baking was always a skill from way on back. And those who baked were paid a little extra, or they got to, if they weren't paid at all, they worked in the kitchen and not in the fields. And it was something that people have used to supplement income, and it still goes on today.
Right. I was just thinking about the cake walk that you would see at carnivals and the cake trail and churches. Yeah. I want to ask you about one of my favorite items to consume, and that is, meringue. And I just want you to talk to me about meringue.
Meringue. Well, meringue.
What's the best way to make it?
Well, do you like the crunchy meringue, or do you like soft meringue?
I like the soft, but with the brown top.
Top. Okay. Well, there you go. Well, meringue, I think, seems so exotic, and yet it's just egg whites and sugar. Maybe a little bit of cream of tartar, if you want to make sure your egg whites really get a lot of volume. But except the best ratio I've found is 2 tablespoons of sugar for every egg white. And if you go a little higher in the sugar, though, it's interesting, and you beat the egg whites till stiff, I think the meringue is a little glossier. It's a little shinier. So that's why, and so if you can increase the sugar, maybe up to 3 tablespoons, you'll get an even shinier meringue. But yeah, so the yolks are used in the pie, the pudding mixture that goes into the pie shell, whether it's chocolate or banana or coconut cream or whatever the flavor is, lemon meringue. And then those egg whites that you've set aside are beaten with the sugar, pinch of salt, maybe a little cream of tartar, and then spread on top. That goes back into the oven that was used to pre-bake the pie shell. And you bake it until it's browned on top. It's about 10 minutes in a 350 oven. And that's it. And
he's
I
not
think that
kidding about loving meringue. When
I love meringue too.
In Greenwood, which is almost 2 hours from here, Malcolm would call me And when I'm coming home on the weekend to pick up a pie for him at the local bakery, a lemon
meringue pie.
Lemon meringue. But isn't Mississippi really known for your really tall meringues? You're like,
Yes.
Oh, yes.
yes.
We
Yeah.
just lost one of the great tall meringue cafes in Greenwood.
Mhm.
The Crystal Grill just closed, and they
Oh,
were known for the foot. I would say
they're
at least
just huge.
meringue, and it's a dying art. You don't see it like you used to with the tall meringue, but I hope it's
yeah. I think meringue is a dying art. And that was why I have so many meringue pie recipes in this book, because I really felt like I need to get them in this book because so they're preserved.
Right.
So people, my kids' age or in their 30s can, will even know what they are because they don't make meringue pies.
Yeah, why do you think that is, that meringue is disappearing? Is it too hard to do? Or too
It's not, but it's not hard, Carol.
No, I know.
Yeah, maybe it's perceived as being hard. Do you think?
I don't know, but I think the three of us should devote ourselves to
that's a good idea.
bringing back
revolution.
Yes, bringing back.
It just seems to have gone out of favor, out of style or something. I don't know. We're going to take a quick break, but when we return, there will be more of our interview with cookbook author and food journalist Ann Byrn. Welcome back to Deep South Dining. There's more of the Ann Byrn interview to come, so let's jump right back into it.
Well, you mentioned chess pie being from Missouri. I baked Edna Lewis's chess pie a couple of weeks ago, so she's been on my mind, but it came from Missouri. And
well, I think it has Midwestern roots. I saw it all over. I was looking for that one place on the map where chess pie originated, and it just was all over. It was across the Midwest. It was definitely in Tennessee and Mississippi, but it was even in a congressional cookbook, and the recipe was supplied by the wife of the governor of Florida. So, but and I tracked her down, and she had Midwestern roots. But I think the connection, and I say in the book, the connection is to cheese and chess, because the word cheese has been used to describe the sort of the consistency of lemon curd, even so creaminess. And that is what there were early old cheese pies in the South that were nothing but butter, sugar, and flour and eggs, and maybe not even flour. They were early transparent pies, but you see some of them dropping the E off of the end of cheese, and the word kind of resembles chess. That is the closest that I've seen to any kind of origin story on chess pie.
Well, that's interesting, because the other one, that people say you put it in a chest, like a pie chest. And your origin story makes much more sense.
Carol, do you remember the chess pie that was the house dessert at Fisherman's Wharf in Biloxi?
Indeed, I do. It was the first time I ever had it.
Wow.
What was it? Was it just a standard chess pie? Did it have cornmeal in it, or was it distinctive?
Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? The place is long.
It was delicious, and the crust was, of course, homemade, because at that time they didn't stamp them out or buy them in a tinfoil pan.
Gerald Ford ate there. And for the longest, they had the plate setting that he used, and he signed it, President Gerald Ford, and then he put the address of whatever the White House is on Pennsylvania Avenue, and he wrote Pennsylvania Street.
Oh, is that right? Ooh.
Anyway, kind of a local thing.
Let's talk biscuits.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I'm still struggling. Every year, we've had this show 5 years. One of my New Year's resolutions is to really master biscuits. And
we even went to biscuit school.
We went to biscuit school, yes.
Did you go to see Scott Peacock?
We did.
I love him. Yeah, his recipe's in the book.
Well, we went to Scott's house and made biscuits,
Nice.
but
It was just that they were so incredibly good
they were good.
that I just don't think I can ever achieve that. Although I did go home and make my own baking powder.
Oh,
True.
here you
Yeah.
go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do,
To start.
do you
And
think that
started
that
there.
helped?
I do.
Mhm.
I do.
Yeah. Yeah.
What
I
do
think
you
there are
think?
well, there are 4 or 5 tips I think that anybody can do that will improve your biscuits. And I think it's, picking the right flour. I think right now Scott is using King Arthur unbleached flour.
Sounds
But
right.
Stella Parks, a pastry chef out of Lexington, Kentucky, I mean, she swears by using gold medal. A lot of people, there's Natalie and Shirley Courier and others across the South, and they swear by White Lily. And they like to buy White Lily self-rising. And White Lily self-rising, there's even an unbleached version of that. But I think it's settling on the right flour that you like. And I would say to experiment with a couple different flours. And then I grew up with biscuits made with vegetable shortening. That's just what people did. Crisco went in the biscuits, and butter, went on them once they were baked. But I think baking with butter in biscuits is just a game changer now, because it changes the flavor and the texture and the color of the biscuits too. So if in deciding what you like, if you like all butter, do you like half butter and half vegetable shortening, or do you like them real cakey and fluffy, which is what vegetable shortening does? And then I add the fat to your flour using your fingertips. I was raised, you cut it in with 2 knives, but if you use your fingertips to sort of massage the fat into the flour, it gets sort of disc-like, and that makes better layers and I think more flakier biscuits. And then, if you're going to use buttermilk, use, full fat if you've got it. And then, like Scott does, don't make your dough can still be a little bit wet, a little bit shaggy. And use a bench scraper, use a tea towel, use something in the kitchen to help you sort of move it. And if you can fold it over itself a couple of times to incorporate, to create a couple of layers, that'll make taller biscuits. And then he pricks the biscuit dough. He pats it out and then pricks it with a fork, which he calls docking. And that allows steam to escape from the biscuits when they're in the oven. Cut them out straight down. Don't wiggle the cutter at all, straight down. And then if you bake them in a cast iron skillet, sort of close together, but not exactly touching, it helps them all rise up together, taller. And I like the crunchy bottoms on the bottom because of the skillet. And bake it in a hot oven, 475.
Sounds simple, Carol.
Yeah, Malcolm, it sounds simple.
Yeah.
Okay, speaking of a hot oven, another great thing I loved about the book were your tips on how to interpret old recipes to our modern, our modern measurements. And one thing was what a hot oven is. And I had a recipe last week that called for a slow oven, and I was going, wait, what is a slow oven? So I kind of figured it out, but I was very
Slow oven
interested
is
that you did all of
300.
those.
300.
Yeah, I think 300 is the
Well, then I
slow
didn't
oven.
figure it out.
Oh,
Now
okay.
you got it though.
And
What did you burn, Carol?
250.
No, I didn't burn. I did 250. I did
Okay.
250.
250. Yeah.
Fine. That's absolutely fine. Yeah, I think that's in so many recipes. It's in some of our old favorite cookbooks and on recipe cards. But slow is 300, moderate is 350, a hot oven. A hot oven is 400. That's what my grandmother would have said. Put it in a hot oven. Extremely hot is 500, and very hot 450.
I also loved learning that a rounded teaspoon is actually 2 level teaspoons, and a heaping teaspoon is actually
Is a
a level tablespoon.
Right.
Who knew?
Measuring is it's so personal. And as much as we can look at all recipes and we can say, well, butter the size of the walnut is 2 tablespoons or whatever. But really, it's we can't, we have no idea of knowing how someone before us measured for that recipe, whether they scooped the scoop down into the sack of flour and brought it back up, or if they spooned it into the cup and leveled it off. And the only way you know that is by watching somebody bake. And, you know, if you still got somebody around who's baking and, you know, you want to bake like them, the best thing you can do is get in the kitchen and watch them,
Yeah,
because
we
that's
have
how you're
such a
going to learn.
great opportunity today with YouTube and
Mhm.
you know, places to go look. And I actually, in my search for biscuits, went and watched a YouTube that Natalie Dupree did. And
Oh,
she
wonderful.
had her big sack of flour and took a big spoon and stirred in the sack.
Hmm.
And, you know, because, you know, I've always been very precious about, you know, about the flour, but she aerated it in the sack and you can just learn so much.
Really.
Like,
It's true.
yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So you're listening to Deep South Dining on MPB Think Radio. We are visiting with Ann Byrn today, who is a cookbook writer and a food journalist. And she has a new book entitled Baking in the American South. And she will join us here in Jackson for the Mississippi Book Festival on 9/14. That's September the 14th. I guess you're on a panel, Ann. Is that right?
Sure what I'm doing, Malcolm, yet,
Okay,
but
but
I
I know
will.
you're going to be
I
at the
think,
book
I
festival.
am on a panel in Mississippi. Yes, I am. I
Good.
am on a panel.
You will
I'm not doing
also
it.
you will also join me on September the 12th at the
Right.
Eudora Welty House for a conversation, I think, in the garden. And you will be in Oxford at Off Square Books on September 11th. Are those dates right?
That is correct. That's correct.
Now,
Yes.
we're going to be at the Welty House, I assume, because in your book, you reference one of Miss Welty's stories. I believe it's Delta Wedding and a recipe in there. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think it's the recipe that's referenced the most often from Delta Wedding is Mashula's coconut cake. And that cake recipe has, you know, has had everybody talking through the years. I did not, and I believe it was maybe Scott Peacock, who sort of created. No, it was a professor of Welty studies who created a recipe from that. I didn't run the recipe in the book, but I created a sort of a riff on it, which are the coconut snowballs. Which, because I think that coconut cake was a big part in making the coconut cake throughout the novel, and placing the almonds on as decoration, and how lemon factors into the cake it's a process. And you know, that was ongoing throughout the novel, was the cake making. And that is how cakes actually came to pull together, I think, in the South. Complicated cakes like that have to be staged as they go, because they're so time consuming. And especially with something like fresh coconut, where you've got to, you know, roast the coconut and extract the meat from it and grate it to be used in the cake making. And the other Welty recipe, the Welty connection to the recipe is Mrs. Mosel's fruit cake, which was in the Jackson Symphony cookbook. And Eudora Welty wrote the foreword to that. Probably was written in the late 70s, I guess.
Yeah.
And that, I love that recipe and the simplicity of it. And, you know, and that was a recipe I knew I wanted to make for this book, because I wanted to go back and bake a fruit cake with new eyes to see, would I like a fruit cake now? But I didn't want to change it much, because it is that recipe's been around forever. And I found that it's a very good recipe, and you can substitute this and that. I know a lot of people don't like to buy the candied cherries, the green and the red around Christmas, and they're harder to find now. But that it's a really delicious cake. So
yeah, I had to grow into liking fruitcake. As a child, I didn't care for it,
My mom loved him so much, but
I do now.
I got tickled. Your 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 story about the fall of the fruitcake, that Calvin Trillin swore there was only one fruitcake ever made, and it was
That's right.
handed back and forth, but never actually
That's
eaten.
right. We've just been passing it around. That's right.
Yeah. Does your fruit?
It's
Oh, it does have half a cup of bourbon, and more
oh,
for
you have
soaking
to.
it.
More for soaking. Yeah. There was in the book I wrote on American cake, I do give a recipe from Tampa, Florida that was really popular. It was another Mrs. So-and-so's fruit cake. But it was a kind of a depression era fruit cake where the alcohol was removed and it had all the extracts in it, lemon extract, orange extract, all these extracts. And I just don't like that recipe as much. I think you have got to have bourbon soaking into a fruitcake, or rum. Another great fruitcake type recipe in the book is the Christmas black cake, which is wonderful. And it is for any people who just don't like red and green cherries, but they like the idea of fruitcake because you can use any dried fruit from your pantry, apricots, figs, prunes, whatever you've got, raisins. And it's just that you just need a certain weight of them, and then it's soaked in dark rum. It's really yummy, really good.
I'm going to ask you a question about custard. I'm a huge
Mhm.
fan of what they call in New Orleans cup custard. I think it's a cousin to flan and perhaps even to creme brulee, but it
Mhm.
is very unique and different to me than just your sort of standard egg custard. This cup
Hmm.
custard that you get in New Orleans, you know, and they turn the cup over and much like flan, and it drains onto it and makes it sort of appear to be floating in a little island there. Are you familiar with the cup custard?
No, I am not. And so
Okay.
here we go. I'm writing it down. I'm gonna. Can you still? Is it something that's only made in homes in New
No,
Orleans,
you
or
can
do you
get it
get
at the
it in
old
the restaurant?
line restaurants,
Okay.
like
Okay.
Galatoire's or
Hmm.
Antoine's, or there are many
Right.
others that make the cup
Okay.
custard. But anyway, I don't know what makes it different. I worked in New Orleans for a while, and there was a woman, an African American woman, who worked in the kitchen, and she made it, and she didn't tell you much about it, but it was really, really delicious. But
Wow. I would say it's probably similar to the flan recipe that's in the book. Um, it would just be eggs and sugar. Yeah, I'd be curious if it has any thickening in it, or if it uses the yolks. Are they the
Mhm.
natural thickener in there? Might
It
have a
has a
little bit of
different
vanilla.
consistency
yeah,
from
it's
a little bit different from flan, and
flan
very
is
different,
smoother
yeah,
and
from
more dense. The
this
cup
has a
Okay,
custard
little more
has a little
jiggly.
fluff,
Yeah.
it's
like
looser.
Creole cream cheese kind of thing or something. I don't know.
Wonderful. Well, I can't wait to try it and then see if I can figure out and look in some Louisiana cookbooks and see how they do it. I'm wondering if it goes into the cup, if it's like baked in a water bath, perhaps, in
Yes,
those
it is
cups
baked
in
in a
the
water
oven.
bath. Yes,
Okay, and then they slide a little knife around it,
that's right.
and
And when they
it
pour it
slides out on
over,
your plate.
it
Mhm.
has this liquid that was in the bottom of the cup, much like
Okay.
the flan, which then,
Uh-huh.
you know, traipses over the custard and makes for
Yummy.
that sort of
Sounds
moat-like.
delicious, delightful. So it's almost like more of like a creme brulee kind of texture, the inside of a creme
Maybe,
brulee
but a
without the
little
crunchy
jigglier.
topping.
More,
Yeah.
Jigglier.
More
Okay.
jigglier, more jigglier.
Okay.
we can all do
That
some more
helps.
research on that.
It's time to take another break, but we'll be right back with more of Ann Byrn on Deep South Dining.
We're back. This is our last segment with Ann Byrn. We hope you enjoy the interview.
Ann
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Malcolm,
Mhm.
another chapter which just really caught my attention is puddings, like cornbread.
Yes.
Who does
Mhm.
chapters on puddings? Ann Byrn.
And one of
I
my
loved the
favorite is
pudding chapter.
banana.
Banana pudding. You
Oh, yeah.
cannot end this without talking banana
No,
pudding.
cannot.
Banana
And
pudding is fascinating. Mhm.
why bananas? Now, we know why in Mississippi because a large portion of all the bananas that come to America come through Gulfport.
Oh, okay. Very
Yeah,
good.
yeah,
Mhm.
that's why bananas
Mhm.
key. But why
Mhm.
bananas in the American South?
Well, because Mobile also bananas came into Mobile, bananas came in New Orleans, and I think and because of railroads, and because of the railroad system and refrigerated railroad cars in the 1880s, bananas were able to get from those port cities up to the East Coast and to other places in the country, but they had to have, stopping points along the rail line, and that's where bananas came into just random places in Kentucky where on the Ohio, Illinois Central, I think the name of the railroad line is. So I think bananas were transported really well. And in the South, to a South that was already accustomed to making custards, like you mentioned, and puddings, but really custards, are what we call pudding today was really a custard. Bananas were an available ingredient. And they often contained meringues. Our family recipe for banana pudding has a meringue on it.
Right.
The early bread puddings in the South, Lena Richard's recipe that I share for an apple bread pudding, it has a meringue on top because you use the yolks in the custard mixture, and then you save those whites for the meringue on top. But I love
South has never gotten over banana pudding. I mean, we're fascinated with it.
No reason to get over it.
Exactly. It satisfies everybody.
Our friend Estes makes a fantastic banana pudding with a baked meringue, but he uses ladyfingers instead of
it's
cookies.
very lovely. Very lovely. And
very refined.
And those were the early recipes. I came across a 1903 Kentucky recipe, and it had cake, leftover bits of cake. I mean, the South was already comfortable making trifles, which was using up leftover pound cake or imported cookies or something like a ladyfinger, layering it in a bowl with custard, with cream, with fruit, with jelly, with jam, whatever. So banana pudding was just maybe a riff, a much simpler riff on that.
It's hard to go into a restaurant that has a meat and three or a diner type restaurant and not have banana pudding in the South.
It's true. It's a good keeper, and it appeals to just about everybody. Yeah.
And like a cobbler, it's often included in the meal.
Yes.
As a dessert, it comes with the dessert.
It's easy to eat. It's easy to
meal.
eat, but all ages like it. You can be young and really old, and you like banana pudding. And you think about it from a cost perspective, it's a really good one for restaurants and meat and threes to have because it can be spooned out easily. It doesn't take a lot of precision. You don't lose slices.
Right.
Yeah, cheap to make.
We are blessed with many persimmon trees around here. And I saw you had a pudding recipe, a persimmon pudding recipe from the great Bill Neal in North Carolina. And
yes,
I can't wait to try it.
It's lovely. It's lovely. And it's simple. It's spoonable, and persimmons are one of those flavors, maybe like figs, that they just maybe less sweet than figs, so they don't really have a flavor of their own, but when you add spices and things to them, they're just delicious. And the color of this pudding is a little like sweet potatoes, but it's got nutmeg and ginger and cinnamon in it, and buttermilk, whole buttermilk. It's a really great pudding.
Well, that's interesting that you say that it doesn't really have a flavor of its own, because last year I made a persimmon cake and it really just tasted like a spice cake. I was disappointed that it didn't have that wonderful persimmon flavor just screaming.
It just doesn't carry through. I've noticed that too with making persimmon cookies. Same thing. You taste the spice. But maybe that's true of baking with sweet potatoes. Do we really taste those when we make a sweet potato cake or muffin or pie? Or do we taste all of the spices inside?
Well, you've just made me feel better about myself.
Yeah, definitely.
Persimmon cake wasn't a failure.
Yeah.
Bread's so important in the South.
Oh gosh, bread fills you up. I mean, grandmother taught us that, you You still hungry? Have sliced bread.
Have
She used
sliced
to,
bread. I
yeah,
saw
have
it. Yeah.
sliced bread.
Yeah, I love homemade bread or locally made bread.
Oh, do too. Do
And there's so
too. I
much to
mean,
do with it.
and I think our bread in the South is different than the rest of the country, and that's really what I've honed in on in that yeast bread chapter. Really, were the rolls and the loaves that I felt like were indicative of the South and unique and just exceptional recipes. Like that sweet potato loaf is
Mhm.
just fantastic. And the old favorite, sourdough, I'd say with sort of air quotes around it, with the made from the potato flakes. I put a recipe for that in there because it's been such a big part of baking in the South. But really the rolls in Nashville, I mean, yeast rolls are just what you always serve at Thanksgiving, Christmas. So I've got 3 or 4 different recipes. And then sweet rolls, turning those rolls into a sweet roll dough. And that Alabama orange roll recipe is really, really good. I don't know if you've had them in
What,
Birmingham, but they're
why
really
is that
good.
such a thing in Alabama and Birmingham?
I never heard of them before till I went there. There are 2 ferries, and I don't get myself in trouble. I kind of stay right in the middle of the 2 ferries because I'm not from there. But one is that they came out of a restaurant in Coleman called All Steak. And the other theory is that there was a caterer in Birmingham named Ewing Steele, and she was the one that kind of put them on the map at private clubs in Birmingham. And so her recipe, and she's a fascinating lady, and her recipe was found in a church cookbook, Birmingham Episcopal Church cookbook, and I was able to track it down because she was a member of that church, and make those rolls, and they are fantastic. And you cut them, you make them like cinnamon rolls, but there's no cinnamon. It's just grated orange zest and sugar, and then you cut them like you would cinnamon rolls, but instead of flipping them up and putting them on a baking pan, you pop them into a muffin pan. So each one bakes up individually, separately, and they're just huge.
Hmm.
And I would bake them and then freeze them in Ziploc bags and then pull them out and put them on a baking pan and reheat them for like Christmas morning or something special. They're
Wow.
really good.
So good.
Okay, my next question has to do with the book itself, which is truly one of the most beautiful cookbooks I've seen.
Thanks.
And Malcolm and I've both seen a lot.
We've seen
We're
some
we're
books.
big collectors.
I saw a quote that said it was big-hearted, and I like that.
Big-hearted.
Yeah.
It is, yes, big-hearted. But I'm fascinated by the photography, and your photography is by Wren Allen, and I'd love to know more about Wren Allen.
Wren Allen is based out of Athens, Georgia. We had met years ago, and when this project was on my radar and then it got approved, I realized it was a mixture of studio photography and also some on the road. And that's what Wren has done all her life. I mean, she has documented Satsuma, production down in Louisiana along the coast. She's very interested in environmental concerns in the South. And she is just an amazing photographer who just balances light and dark. And every photo looks like a work of art, really, how she just approaches things. So I was just delighted to work with Wren eggs from a local farmer. And they were the most gorgeous hues, and they were baby blue and bronze and creamy yellow. And we just stared at those eggs. And she photographed the eggs, and then she stuck, the photo up on the wall with like a Polaroid. And that became our muse for all of the photography for the book. And it's really true. If you look at eggs, there's light, there's dark, there's warm, there's cool. And then, that was really reflected in a lot of the colors that we chose to work with throughout the book.
Wow.
And your food stylist, Tammy?
Tammy Hardiman and her assistant, Angela Hinkle, were there the first week. So the first week we did everything that was complicated, believe me. And we had, the trifles, the meringue pies, anything that had a lot of glory to it. We wanted that week with the food stylist, but they're busy and expensive. And so the second week, I was the food stylist. So that's where we did the cornbread, the biscuits, the cookies, and things are a little bit more down to earth. But
If our
yeah,
listeners have noticed certain banging and shuffling sound, it's Carol over here with this incredible book, leafing through it, moving it about.
And turning it and showing
It's showing
Malcolm.
me pictures across the table. It's kind of like sitting around the kitchen table talking about a book, a new book by Byrn. And we are so happy that you came to see us today. Thanks for joining us. And before we go, I wondered if there's something you'd like to share with us that we haven't asked you, something you'd like to get to or leave us with.
Wow. Well, I think maybe I'll just sum up what we said about, Southern baking was the first and the finest style of baking in our country. And it really is all due to the people of the South and the land. And I think if there's a recipe that you're curious about that's been in your family for a long time, sometime, and you don't really understand the recipe or where it came from, knowing who might have made the recipe and where they came from and what they had to work with, what ingredients were accessible, can tell you a lot of the story behind the recipe.
Well, thank you for joining us. And also, please thank Carrie Bachman, who did an outstanding job of providing us with information and books and lots of
definitely,
background.
I will.
Tremendous job.
Definitely, yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us again. And I look forward to seeing you in September.
Yes.
We are
Yeah.
here in Jackson, in Mississippi, at the Book Festival, the Welty House, and also Off Square Books in Oxford.
Sounds great. I look forward to it.
See you
Thank
soon.
y'all both.
Yeah, bye, Ann. That was great. Thanks for giving us your time.
Absolutely, Carol. It was wonderful. Thank you.
We've come to the end of a great interview.
It was such a pleasure to speak with Ann. And Malcolm, I am so excited about all the events in Mississippi.
Absolutely. Ann will be at Off Square Books in Oxford on September 11, the Eudora Welty House with yours truly on September 12th, and she will be at the renowned Mississippi Book Festival on September 14th. Deep South Dining is a production of Mississippi Public Broadcasting's Think Radio. We are funded by the generous contributions from listeners like yourself, and we thank you. Our show was produced by Marissa Vaughn. For my co-host, Carol Palmer, for our special guest, Ann Byrn, I am Malcolm White, and we ask that you now stay tuned for Marshall Ramsey's program, Now You're Talking, followed by Southern Remedy at 11.